My name is Will, and this is the 15th video in a series about the DC Comics character Martian Manhunter. After Dan Jurgens' run on Justice League America, John is moved over to a new book, Justice League Task Force. The idea of this book was that it would feature stories from different writers. Each writer would get to pick a different set of Justice League characters for their story. They would write a story lasting 1 to 3 issues and then pass the book on to the next writer to tell a different story with different characters. The connecting premise was that special teams would be created for specific missions, so each story would have its own cast. Now, a few characters were set up as reoccurring characters, notably Hannibal Martin, the team's government handler, Gypsy, and John himself. This rotating writer period of Justice League Task Force lasted from issues 1 to 13, roughly from 1993 to 1994. After that, Mark Waid took over writing duties for Justice League Task Force, as it participated in the Justice League crossover Judgement Day. During this 13-issue rotation period, John is passed from writer to writer. David Micheline, Chuck Dixon, Dennis O'Neil, Peter David, Jeff Loeb, and Michael Jan Friedman would all take a turn writing Justice League Task Force. Although Dennis O'Neil's story did not include John, but remember that J.M. DeMatteis had essentially erased all of O'Neil's stories about the Martian people and completely changed John's personality, so maybe O'Neil wasn't interested in revisiting John. So, when a character is passed from writer to writer, there isn't really much opportunity for character development, and the personality of the character can also not really come through. Now, in the stories during this period, John is often a fairly central character, but he often wasn't depicted in a very consistent way. I'm going to talk about 4 of the stories in Task Force, skipping the 2 where he did little or wasn't in them at all. I will also talk about the stories from Showcase 93, Justice League Quarterly 11, and Justice League America Annual Number 8. That were all about John and roughly in this time period. Then I will talk about some general elements in his depictions over these couple years. David Micheline tells the first story and sets up the Task Force premise. He starts with John taking out a terrorist cell in Canada. This is interesting because it is a continuation of the idea presented in Justice League International that John was a global hero who didn't limit his activities to the US. This is mainly interesting because John Ostrander would take this idea and expand on it quite a bit. Okay, in this first issue of Task Force, you see that John lives in a small cabin in upstate New York. Now, previously he had been shown renting a cabin for a meditative retreat, but now he seems to have purchased a home. And he seems to be attached to it, thinking that it is a place he can be himself. And it highlights both his lack of a civilian identity and the given and DeMatteis era idea that he has a real Martian self, beyond his public superheroic identity. John is about to relax when a government operative named Hannibal Martin shows up and asks John to lead a special Justice League strike team. John immediately agrees, and you quickly have a repeat of John's relationship with Maxwell Lord. John once again answers to a government operative, and you get very much the sense that John is the establishment hero. He basically works for the government and is fine reporting to someone else. In contrast, once John left the League, Superman took over the role of leader until his death. And he did not like working with Maxwell Lord, repeatedly opposing Lord. But John comfortably settles into the role of government agent once again. And when the team is burned by their government handler, many of the team are angry, but John quietly accepts what was done. John does use his role to his advantage, as he recruits Gypsy in order to take care of her, since she is no longer employed by the conglomerate and has only 2 job skills, theft and being a superhero. So he reaffirms his connection to Gypsy. He also recruits Aquaman, but doesn't really have any meaningful conversations with his old friend. One of the weird parts of this story is that Nightwing joins the team, and strangely John doesn't like him and resents him trying to lead the team. To me, this doesn't feel like John, who is usually a leader because he has to be and not because he wants to be. And also, who doesn't like Nightwing? This dislike of his leadership being challenged is a big contrast with later on in the run, during the Judgment Day crossover, where he is the one who makes sense to lead the League, but he instead lets others lead. That said, John being frustrated with his teammates was kind of a standard thing during his Justice League International days. Anyway, the story centers around a Central American rebellion, an arms dealer with a death machine. And while Micheline starts the comic with some scenes showing off John's power when he takes out a terrorist cell and saves some hostages, in most of the story John feels like he isn't doing much. Part of this is because he spends a decent amount of time unconscious due to being zapped by the death machine. But the story does reference DeMatteis' new origin, with him taking his true Martian form and mentioning that the name John Jones isn't really his name. He also references the idea of having a hidden true self. So Micheline definitely brought elements from John's first limited series into the story. The next story I want to talk about is in Showcase 93, and it is done by Len Wein. Len pulls in different elements, and one interesting thing is that he directly references the name John Jones as what John was called on Mars, in contrast to what DeMatteis said in his limited series that was repeated a few months earlier by Micheline. But Wein does call John a philosopher and a poet, which did seem to connect back to DeMatteis' presentation of the character as a peaceful being who played the role of a superhero. Wein also references the love of Oreos. The central story is that John has a midnight craving for Oreos. He goes to a convenience store and stops a robbery, and then he tracks down an old woman who stole the last bag of Oreos. Not because she stole them, but because he really wants those cookies. The old woman has a heart attack, and John impersonates her dead son to give her peace in her final moments. He then leaves the cookies behind and declares that being a telepathic shapeshifter can be a first-class pain. One of the interesting things about this story is it bears a lot of similarities to the Ray Bradbury story, The Martian, where a Martian impersonates the son of an elderly couple to give them some peace, but he does this because he can't control his ability to change shape, making his powers a real first-class pain. The next Justice League Task Force story with John is done by Peter David. Now, Peter David wrote for John before in Secret Origins 32, where he kept it lighthearted and threw in an Edgar Rice Burroughs reference. So we know Peter David likes comedy in the pulp era, and when given the chance to write for Task Force, he decides to write a humorous story inspired by the pulp novel She by Henry Rider Haggard. In this novel, there is a secret African tribe ruled by a queen who is referred to as She Who Must Be Obeyed. In these comics, Peter David throws in an Amazon twist, having the jungle tribe being composed of alien women led by Her Who Must Be Served. Anyway, the core of the story is that an agent, named after Henry Rider Haggard, the author of She, is transporting a deadly virus called the MacGuffin virus. A MacGuffin is a term for a plot device that drives the plot, but that is also unimportant to the story, so Peter David is being real clear about the narrative purpose of this virus. The agent is captured by a subterranean tribe of women called the Daals. These Daals refuse to negotiate with men, so John must put together an all-woman team. Then he is forced to transform into a woman himself in order to lead the team, because Wonder Woman can't be trusted in a leadership position? Once they encounter the Daals, their leader, Her Who Must Be Served, instantly falls for Ja'on, or Ja'on as they now call her. Him. Them. So, Ja'on has to agree to a marriage while the rest of the team locates the MacGuffin and the agent. Anyway, it is revealed that the leader of the Daals is transsexual in order to perpetuate the species. When Her Who Must Be Served wants to consummate their relationship with Ja'on, Ja'on decides that they aren't willing to go that far and turns back into Ja'on, and he and his team escape with the MacGuffin and the agent. But not before Ja'on has a tender moment with Her Who Must Be Obeyed, telling her that he is sorry to have deceived her. So in the grand tradition of Shakespeare, a man dressing up as a woman is used for both comedy and to create weirdly uncomfortable sexual situations as part of that comedy. So the notable thing is that Ja'on is very self-conscious about turning into a woman and comes across very much as a typical guy. At one point he even declares his lack of understanding of women, and he demands that no one inform Booster Gold, Guy Gardner, Blue Beetle, or Batman, basically his guy friends, about him turning into a woman. But to counter this, the form he takes does not embody female modesty and makes Miss Martian look like a nun. So this story is fairly outside the normal range of stories with Ja'on in them and offers a fairly different take on Ja'on. The gender insecurity doesn't really fit in Ja'on well, in my opinion, but certainly has a level of relatability. The next story, by Jeff Loeb, also presents a Ja'on who feels more like a typical guy than how Ja'on is normally portrayed. In most portrayals, Ja'on will relax with quiet meditation, but in this story, he wants to stuff his face while watching a fight on TV. The story does have him actually fall asleep instead of watching the fight, and he reverts to his true form, and he starts sleep levitating. So the idea of his true form is kept alive in this story. The story itself centers around some New Bloods who Ja'on encounters. The New Bloods were a bunch of new characters created as part of the Bloodbath event, and most of these characters were quickly abandoned. But Jeff Loeb used his Justice League Task Force issue to highlight his creation, Loose Cannon, who did get his own limited series. Now, in this story, Loeb goes for humor and actually dedicates the story to Keith Giffen. So Loeb really leans into the characterization of Ja'an, where he has to deal with his frustrating teammates. But instead of having to deal with Booster, Beetle, and Guy, Ja'an has to deal with the New Bloods, Wildman, Geist, Joe Public, and Loose Cannon. Now, I'm not going to say much about this story, besides the fact that Ja'an stays very calm despite being punched multiple times, and his long-suffering patience is highlighted over his power. The last story is done by Jan Michael Friedman, and in part works to set up the coming Justice League crossover, Judgment Day. In it, Ja'an puts together an infiltration team to infiltrate a white supremacist terror group secretly supported by a politician. But before I talk about this story, I want to talk about Ja'an's appearance in Justice League Quarterly 11, because it is referenced in this story. Okay, Justice League Quarterly 11 by Pat McGreal and Dave Rawson tells a story about Ja'an becoming involved in the civil rights struggle, specifically the Birmingham campaign in 1963. Now, the names and events are shifted a little bit. The place is Wilmington instead of Birmingham, and he meets a Reverend Delroy and not a Reverend King. The 4 young girls murdered by the Klan become a single girl who survives with burns all over her body. But the story matches the Birmingham campaign very closely. Ja'an comes to Wilmington to visit a reporter friend who is sick. The reporter convinces him to investigate the burning of the church that burned the little girl. The real event was a bomb that killed 4 girls. Ja'an begins to investigate and is met with suspicion by the black community and hostility from the police. He changes into a black man, Bill Smith, and is able to connect to the black community. This, of course, gets him threatened by the police. After this, he goes to his reporter friend in his white John Jones disguise and learns that he intends to lie about what is happening. John shames him and then becomes black again in order to march alongside the protesters. Like with the real marches, the police used dogs, fire hoses, and clubs to beat the peaceful protesters, some of whom were children. John lowers his defenses in order to feel the blows and to share the pain with the protesters, which speaks to a Ja'an with a deep sense of empathy. The reporter, who he had shamed, decides to report the truth and show the world what is happening. In real history, the images that came out of the Birmingham campaign and the violent suppression of it made a big difference in civil rights, helping to pass the contentious Civil Rights Act of 1964. Ja'an fits really well into this story. Because of his non-shifting origin date, he has been around for a lot of history. He is also an outsider looking in, but can also be white and be black. He can exist on both sides of this divide. At the end of the story, he reflects on how to stand up to evil, and not just the evil of alien invaders or supervillains, but the hatred of one group for another. Okay, back to Justice League Task Force, where we have another story about racism, although this one is less rooted in history. Ja'an assembles a team to infiltrate a white supremacist group that has created a plague to kill anyone of non-European heritage. One of the people he recruits is the original Our Man. Our Man at first refuses until he finds out that the white supremacist group are essentially Nazis, and he feels he has to honor the sacrifices made to fight against the Nazis, and he joins Ja'an. Things do not go smoothly, and Ja'an and his team are defeated and imprisoned. Our Man is able to free the team, but the Nazis launch a missile carrying the plague. Ja'an, the strongest in the team, reflects on his own world and his family, killed by a plague, and he refuses to let Earth thus suffer the same fate. He goes up to do the classic move of stopping a missile in flight, and he is able to destroy the missile. So this period of Justice League Task Force ends with the Justice League crossover Judgment Day. At this time, there were 3 Justice League books, and when the Overmaster, a genocidal space god, returns to destroy human life, all 3 teams come together under Wonder Woman. But Captain Atom had recently rejoined the Justice League and was frequently challenging her leadership. Note that Ja'an does not try to take leadership and even defers to Captain Atom in the field. I think this fits okay with previous depictions of Ja'an. He never really wants to be a leader, but is thrust into the role by necessity. Now, this doesn't mean he's happy with the Wonder Woman-Captain Atom feud, and he frequently is frustrated by the conflict and the inability of the Justice League members to cooperate. In one instance, he comes up with a plan to have them all use their abilities together, but when they mess it up, he tells them to get out and just takes care of it himself. You have this notion that he is trying to get them to work together as a team rather than use his full powers, which fits pretty well with his time in Justice League International. Now, in Judgment Day, there are kind of 4 important Ja'an moments. The first is the fall of Booster Gold. Booster is irrationally confident because he thinks he knows the future, and one of the threads of this story is that time is messed up, and this sets up Zero Hour, the DC-wide crossover. So Booster thinks he will be a big hero and instead gets himself sliced in half. John tries to save his life and fails, and his friend dies. There's a moment where he seems like he would take control, being one of the few people both Wonder Woman and Captain Atom would defer to, but he does not. The second moment is when Gypsy is buried by an avalanche during battle. John wants to search for her, but Booster and Wonder Woman convince him to leave her behind. So John has to leave the woman, who he sees as a daughter, for dead, and instead press on to confront the Overmaster. And this is a classic heroic choice. Do you save your friend, or do you try to save the world? John makes a choice to save the world, although he is clearly torn. John then has to confront another friend and face a similar choice. The Overmaster has taken control of Ice, and while Ice is not as close to John as Gypsy, they certainly had a few tender moments, and Ice has stated that she sees John as a mentor. Now Ice stands between John and the Overmaster. Captain Atom is ready to vaporize her, but the grieving John refuses to fight her and lose another friend. Instead, helps her realize who she really is because he has total confidence in her. Note that Fire, who is Ice's best friend, had previously tried this and failed. So John's understanding and depth of trust in his friends is very highlighted. The last moment with focus on John is after Ice has died. He reflects a lot on the League, and he talks about his disdain for the press in relation to Ice's death. This reinforces a long-held opinion from John that really was highlighted during the Legends event. Anyway, Blue Beetle breaks ranks and talks to the press, which seems to devastate John. At this point, the League is kind of wrecked and has lost its governmental sanction due to them disobeying the orders of the UN. The three parts of the League split into three completely separate organizations. Wonder Woman and Captain Atom form separate Justice Leagues, while in the remaining issues of Justice League Task Force, John goes off to form his own Justice League that is focused on training younger heroes. When Judgment Day was coming out, DC was doing Elseworld annuals. They had been doing themed annuals since 1991, so every year each comic would produce a special book that fit into a story or fit a certain theme. For example, the New Blood characters I mentioned earlier were produced by one of these annual events. The Justice League America Annual number 8 by Dan Votto featured John quite a bit and has an interesting role for him, so I'm going to talk about it. The central Elseworld story is that Felix Faust defeats the Justice League with a magical trap. John was not caught by the trap, but instead hid by shape-changing into an old man. He hides and plans for 100 years, building a new Justice League. He then goes with them to confront Faust. In a twist, the new Superman turns out to be a plant who turns on the team. John reveals himself and shows a new form that has an elongated head and body spines, similar to the true form shown for Martians, but that also has a muscular body and traditional costume associated with his superhero guise. Anyway, he beats this new Superman and goes to confront Faust. Faust repeats the spell he used to defeat the original Justice League, which instead releases their souls, and those souls take vengeance on Faust. This was all part of John's plan and the reason he recreated the Justice League. He also admits that he had hoped that the original Justice League was still alive and trapped, and not just trapped souls. You get a lot of classic John elements collected here. He is a patient planner. He works on a plan for 100 years, so he is also long-lived, another character element. John is willing to sacrifice and chooses to keep concealed over saving his friends in order to preserve his plan. These traits are reinforced, as is his role as a guide and teacher for the rest of the Justice League. You also get an interesting artistic take on him with a look that combines his hero form and his true Martian form. I don't think it ever really gets used again, though. Okay, before I end this video, I want to touch on 3 of John's attributes which undergo changes over the years: his powers, his weakness to fire, and his appearance. The Martian Manhunter's powers are fairly consistent during this period. He has great strength, is resistant to injury, can fly, turn invisible, change his shape, fire beams from his eyes, has superior vision that can see through things, and he has some telepathy allowing him to read surface thoughts, find people, and communicate. This is a long list, but I want to point out that his telepathy was pretty weak, and he didn't have the ability to phase through anything. His shape-changing is primarily used to confuse and trick enemies, and he doesn't use much of a battle form or anything, although you could say that his standard form is his battle form. In terms of power level, he is shown as powerful, but not overwhelmingly so. He struggles to stop a missile in flight. In the last video, I listed some of John's most impressive feats, but during this period, he doesn't really stretch his powers much. If I was going to list his flexes for this period, they would probably be emotional ones, like turning ice back to the light and marching for civil rights. John also doesn't seem invulnerable, being able to be hurt by a strong villain Iron Cross, or knocked out by a weapon. He also easily gets defeated by the Psychics, Sa'ar the Ageless and Blind Faith. So without being so invulnerable, the fire weakness isn't really needed. It only shows up a couple of times. He mentions a fear of fire when he doesn't want to fly over lava, but it is established that this is psychological and he overcomes it in order to save someone. He also mentions that fire can't hurt him when he is attacked by Parallax, but then he discovers that Parallax fire can hurt him because Parallax is just ridiculously powerful. So at this point, the fire weakness wasn't used much, and it was established as being psychosomatic and not a real vulnerability. So the efforts of J.M. DeMatteis to remove the weakness did have some traction at this point. Another thing that begins to change is his costume. The artist Sal Velluto was the primary artist on Justice League Task Force up till issue 24. He makes the cape a little more flowing and adds some movement to the collar. In issue number 7, he finally flips the collar fully up and adds the medallion cloak clasps that have that fourth world feel. This is also the issue where Sal draws the female design for John, which once again is not very modest. But Velluto would keep these changes, and after issue 24, Ramon Bernardo became the artist and he pushed the collar even higher. Now the medallion clasp became a fixed part of the character design and extended to his belt, so each of the shoulder clasps match his belt. But in the future, some artists would draw the collar as folded and some would have it up, so it wasn't super consistent. Another visual change added by Velluto was arm hair. Velluto added lots of lines to his figures to add texture and shape, and these lines ended up looking like arm hair. Should John have arm hair? My opinion is no, but this art was done in 1993 and they didn't have the same set of coloring tools, so I wouldn't fault any artist for working to add depth and texture to their drawings. Okay. After the Judgment Day crossover, you immediately have the DC-wide crossover event, 0 Hour. And after these events, the book is retooled. It gets a dedicated writer, and you get a more cohesive take on the Martian Manhunter by Mark Waid and Christopher Priest. In the next video, I will talk about 0 Hour, the retooling of the Justice League, and the reimagining of Justice League Task Force.